Good afternoon, everyone, or good morning. Welcome, and thank you for joining the International Foundation for Electoral Systems, or IFES, in our webinar series on elections during the COVID-19 pandemic. This is the fourth installment in our series, following the first one back in May on perspectives from election management bodies, the second on electoral integrity and disinformation, and the third on increasing the active participation of youth. IFES supports electoral processes broadly defined across the world, and here in Europe we have supported elections in European countries since the late 1980s. I'm Magnus. I'm the IFES Senior Political Finance Advisor, and I'm also Director of the Regional Europe Office of IFES in Prague, which is hosting this webinar. This event is part of a larger USAID-funded program of democracy assistance with the goal of supporting leadership that champions democratic practices and is made possible by the generous support of the American people. Today, 1 billion people in the world have a disability. And IFES supports the fostering of partnerships among disabled persons organizations, civil society, and governments. We strive to remove barriers which prohibit the full participation of persons with disabilities as voters, as poll workers, as policy advocates, as election observers, and as candidates. Unfortunately, the current pandemic has heightened existing inequalities, threatening both health and democratic freedoms and rights. And it's increasing the political exclusion of many people already underrepresented in political life. So this webinar aims to explore how access and inclusion can be improved during the COVID-19 pandemic and beyond. And we are excited to have prominent activists and experts join us to present their perspectives on opportunities, innovations, and challenges, and how the international community can support the active participation of persons with disabilities in the political and electoral process. First, we have IFES Senior Global Inclusion Advisor, Virginia Atkinson, to explore the context of these issues and to highlight IFES's work in the region and beyond to advance the inclusion of persons with disabilities in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic. We will then hear from Seinep Dyikanbaeva, who is Program Manager at the Public Organization of Parents of Children with Disabilities in Kyrgyzstan. She will be followed by Mariam Mikiashvili, who is Deputy Director at the School for the Blind in Tbilisi, in Georgia. After this, we will hear from Yuliia Sachuk, who is civil activist and NGO coordinator for the organization Fight for Right in Ukraine. And our final speaker will be Gaël Martin-Micallef, who is legal advisor at the Venice Commission. And following our panelists, we will open the floor for questions and comments to our speakers. Should you have any questions or comments, please type those in using the chat function in Zoom, and you can do that at any time. Please note that, as Nicoletta mentioned, this webinar is being simultaneously interpreted into 5 voiced languages and 6 sign languages. To make that possible, we have asked our panelists to speak slowly, and you will notice me taking pauses at different points to allow our interpreters to catch up. We have also asked our speakers not to use screen share or PowerPoints to make it easier for participants following our webinar through sign language interpretation. So first, I would like to turn to my colleague Virginia Atkinson at IFES to set the context for today's discussion. Virginia, what would you say are the main barriers that people with disabilities face to participation in political life?
Good morning, Magnus. Everyone, I'm looking forward to this conversation today. To answer your question, there's quite a few barriers, unfortunately, that many people with disabilities experience to participation in political life. One of the biggest ones is actually discriminatory legal frameworks. So a majority of countries around the world actually have clauses in their election law that say if you're, quote, of unsound mind, or a myriad of other unsavory terms, then you are not allowed to vote or run for office. Many election laws also have clauses that say something about if you don't speak the native language of the country, for example, then you're not eligible to run for office. And in many contexts, that doesn't include the native sign language in the country. So these legal barriers are really a huge issue because it doesn't matter what other steps we take throughout the electoral process to make it accessible and inclusive if there's this very first stumbling block with the legal framework. I think when we talk about barriers to political participation, the first thing that many people think of is also physical barriers. So access to polling stations, to political party headquarters, parliaments, debate venues. In many countries around the world, even including here in the US, there was a recent study that actually only about 40% of polling stations here are accessible. And the side effect of making polling stations accessible is that many of them are in schools. So if every country around the world was to make all of their polling stations accessible, we would also be making schools more accessible for students and teachers with disabilities. Another barrier that we see is related to inaccessible information. So political party manifestos and voter education information are rarely produced, for example, in easy to read, or sign language, or braille, or large font. So it's difficult for people with disabilities to have accurate information, both on who to vote for and what the process of voting is and where they should go. And then one of the last really large barriers that we see is related to stigma and discrimination. So over the last several years, we've been seeing a big shift to political life moving online. And one of the other big side effects of that is unfortunately an increase in hate speech and ableist speech. And when I say ableist speech, I'm referring to sort of derogatory terms that are associated with disability being directed at people with disabilities themselves, or using those terms as an insult to someone who doesn't have a disability. So there's still a lot more work for us to do to make sure that the political process is accessible and inclusive.
Thank you, Virginia. And of course, these issues have hardly been improved with the current pandemic. So how is COVID-19 impacting the political participation of persons with disabilities?
Yeah, so as I just mentioned, the move online, the move of political life online has actually been accelerated because of COVID. And the digital divide is disproportionately impacting many people with disabilities. Not all people with disabilities have access to internet at their home, for example, so they can't engage in webinars like this one, or get out the vote initiatives that might be on social media. Some people with disabilities might not have access to laptops or assistive devices like screen readers that they may have had in their offices. We're also seeing a communication barrier with the personal protective equipment, with PPE. With the increased use of face masks, it's making it more difficult for people who are deaf or hard of hearing because the masks block visual cues like facial expressions and lip reading and emotions. A good point there is that we are seeing some solutions, and there's been the development of clear masks, and that helps with lip reading. So it's not all bad, and we do have an opportunity to sort of build back better with many of the alternative measures that are being discussed right now. So for example, in many countries around the world, because of the pandemic and fears about showing up to vote in person, countries are exploring online voting or postal voting or advanced voting as a response to the pandemic. And all of these different alternative measures could benefit the disability community if they were made permanent. That said, I do want to stress that these alternative measures don't mean that EMBs or election management bodies don't have to make polling stations accessible anymore. because some people with disabilities would prefer to vote in person, some would prefer to use one of these alternative measures. So there should be options. Some people with disabilities, for example, find absentee voting helpful because it means they don't have to navigate some of the barriers that we discussed earlier, like inaccessible public transportation or waiting in a queue, worrying about the inaccessibility of the polling station, or being concerned that poll workers might question their right to vote when they do get to the polling station. So in the current context, absentee voting also provides a way to safely vote without risking exposure to the virus. And some people with disabilities are immunocompromised or might have a pre-existing health condition, which might put them at an even higher risk from the virus. So avoiding exposure, becomes particularly important in that case. In addition to mitigating the risks around the virus, there's also some benefits around independence and privacy for some voters when they vote from home. So they can use their own assistive device, like an adapted keyboard or software such as a screen reader or voice recognition software if they have it, to mark their ballot, which wouldn't be available in the polling station. And this is something that's been discussed quite frequently, actually, here in the US, for example. There's an estimated 7 million adults that have a visual disability, and advocates here are concerned that some might choose skipping voting altogether rather than risk catching the virus or having their ballot privacy compromised because, for example, postal voting isn't accessible to people who are blind. So the pandemic has really reinforced an already existing need for accessible voting options for people with disabilities.
Okay, so there are quite a lot of challenges, but before we get too discouraged, we need to discuss how we can improve the situation. What are key best practices or lessons learned that we can draw from around the world on political inclusion of persons with disabilities in the pandemic context?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so quite a few countries actually have had elections so far. So we do have some good practice examples to draw from. One of those is developing political materials in accessible formats. So for example, in Bolivia, they had an election recently, and they developed online trainings for their poll workers for the very first time because of the virus. And they included sign language in those videos. So people who are deaf could participate in the poll worker training and then be certified to serve in this leadership position. In Burma, IFES is working with Future Stars, which is a self-advocacy organization comprised of people with intellectual disabilities. And we're working to develop an easy-to-read guide on how to stay safe while participating in political life ahead of their November elections. We're also working with another DPO, Shwe Thar Foundation, to develop a mobile app that originally had information on COVID-19, and we're now repurposing that app for education messages. So putting materials in accessible formats is one good practice that we're seeing that applies in the pandemic and beyond. Something that we're seeing that's very pandemic specific is civil society organizations that are working together to maintain a sense of community and common purpose in lockdown. So for example, in Kyrgyzstan, we supported a group of young people with and without disabilities to organize Instagram live sessions, which were focused on how to deal with sort of the isolation and the anxiety that's brought on by lockdown.
Can you speak slower, please?
Yep. As well as the hygiene measures to prevent the spread of the virus. In Tunisia, we've held a series of webinars with the deaf community to discuss how they've been impacted by the virus and also the government's response to the virus. So the first webinar focused on the social and economic impacts caused by the virus and the government's response. The second was conducted with journalists and focused on the lack of representation of deaf people in the media. And then the next webinar is going to address barriers to and opportunities for civic engagement of deaf Tunisians. Then the third thing is something I think we're all familiar with, and that's moving in-person trainings and advocacy and workshops online. So for example, in Pakistan, IFES had been planning to do an in-person training with a group of women with disabilities on how to advocate with the government on public policy reform. So this was planned right before the lockdowns all started happening. We sort of very quickly had to adapt and move it to an online context. So what we did first is conduct a survey with all of the participants to see, do they even have access to internet at home to do an online training? And if so, how long could they participate in an online training? You know, what type of technology did they have at home? You know, a laptop versus a phone, because that might influence the types of activities that we could do on the online training. And we also asked about reasonable accommodations that they might require in order to participate in an online training, because the answer to that question is going to be different than when we had been planning to do it in person. So the survey results indicated that most people actually had access to a smartphone, but not a laptop. And they had access to a separate room or a quiet space for only a limited amount of time each day. So we needed to adjust how many hours a day the training was going to be if we were switching it to an online implementation. We also learned that a majority of the respondents had actually never participated in an online training. So we did a training on how to use Zoom before we did the training. And then in addition to updating the delivery method, we also updated the content. So the curriculum now focuses on building participants' capacity to identify government bodies in charge of the COVID response and to identify the current, COVID response policies and any gaps related to disability inclusion in those policies. And then also we updated the curriculum to include more focus on virtual advocacy techniques so that everyone could make sure that they're focusing on remaining safe while they're staying at home during the pandemic. So those are three areas that we're seeing good practices emerge in terms of materials in accessible formats, maintaining a sense of community and common purpose, and then tailoring trainings and workshops from in person to online.
Thank you very much, Virginia. We'll take a brief pause to allow our interpreters to catch up. So these are examples of things that are being done, what are the challenges that are not being adequately addressed at the moment, or not being addressed at all, Virginia?
So there's some challenges that were around pre-pandemic that have just been exacerbated now. And then there's also some challenges that are entirely new and are brought on by the pandemic. Two things that have been exacerbated by the pandemic are, one is the need for more awareness raising and training for political actors. So for election management bodies, political parties, election observers, all of the actors across the entire electoral cycle, on the unique barriers to political participation that are encountered by people with disabilities. A second barrier that was around pre-pandemic and has just been exacerbated is stigma and discrimination. And that is really the root of many of the other barriers that we've been discussing today. And a good solution for that we're starting to see is an increased focus on civic education. And so that helps to prevent stereotypes, from developing in the first place. Then there's two things that we're seeing that are really brought on by the pandemic in particular. One of those is that IFES is noticing disabled persons organizations and other civil society groups need more support on crisis management and psychosocial support. So many advocates were already working long hours. They might have already been putting their lives at risk in some cases, advocating for democracy and inclusion in their country. And now they have the additional stressors that are brought on by the pandemic. And then the second thing we're seeing that's new because of COVID is the sort of shifting funding landscape. So understandably, many donors and international development actors have been prioritizing health programs, but there isn't necessarily always the link being made there that quality health responses depend on a participatory and well-functioning government. So we shouldn't forget the importance of democracy and governance work to effective COVID responses. And many of our civil society partners and DPOs are seeing the work that they were doing on democracy and governance being sort of shifted and that funding taken away to health programs. So once this immediate impact of the pandemic is over, we could see secondary impacts related to the situation on democracy and governance in these countries. So those are some of the challenges that were somewhere around pre-pandemic and some that are new now.
Thank you very much, Virginia. Thank you. We will now hear from our panelists on how they are working to mitigate the barriers to political exclusion. And first up, before I hand over to our first panelist, Seinep, Dyikanbaeva, we're going to take another short break to allow our interpreters to catch up. And at this point, we ask those of you who are following this webinar through American Sign Language to switch to the other interpreter. And you do this by selecting Gallery View, finding the ASL interpreter 2, you will see her being active with the video screen. Right-click on her video and select Pin. So, first up is Seinep Dyikanbaeva, who is from the Public Organization of Parents of Children with Disabilities in Kyrgyzstan. Please, Seinep, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to participate in the event. First of all, more than 169,000 people with disabilities live in Kyrgyzstan, and more than 3 million people participating in votes in last vote elections. But however, there is a problem. How old data about how many people with disabilities participated in the vote process, and we suggested to include this data information into following elect process, and we gave this recommendation. But in the past years, we have had the experience how people with disabilities, however, there are have not any developed policy previously about election of people with disabilities. As people with disabilities who could come to the polling place by themselves and get a vote. However, I want to share my experience personally. I voted. Just I came to the voting places and voted as everyone else, and it's very good. However, once I want to make an experiment how to vote at home, because previously we have a policy that elderly people and people with disability or people have some health problem could vote at home. Therefore, I wanted to know how it will be, and I just made this experience. And I want to say that nothing better than voting in the public place where everybody voted. Therefore, that's very important that people with disability voted in the polling place that everyone else. And thank you very much for IFES that they work with their partners with election commission in Kyrgyz Republic to create the conditions that people with disabilities could participate in the process, and not just to give the votes, but to be candidates. And now we have a big progress on it. For instance, because of the IFES working in the Kyrgyz Republic, we have a new legislation that allows people with disabilities to apply the states of developing a certain condition for persons with disabilities, such as braille system, accommodations for people with disabilities, just like a personal assistant. That's very important because now we have a developing policy on people with disabilities in voting process, and now also people with disabilities started to participate in the process, such as candidate for the soon election process. Two persons with disabilities from each parties. Now we have 17 parties. They become a candidates. Before, it was only one deputy in the parliament who could, became a parliament member. That's a very huge progress for our countries. And also, I wanted to say that the people with disabilities in Kyrgyzstan, they also become a very active participating in the observation process, in the monitoring process. And the IFES also doing the pre and monitoring and post monitoring process of election, how it now is going on. For instance, now 65% of the voting place are accessible. However, we have a vision like if we install a ramp, this is an accessibility. However, it's not enough. Therefore, we just recommend the state to create all conditions for equality, that people with disabilities could vote as everyone else. And also people with disability hired to the election commission, and they are now work to the call staff. That's also very good progress in this area. However, rather than we have this progress, we have several problems. As I said, there's no general statistics that will be available publicly. How many people participating in the voting process? How many people give their votes? It will be very good to have the statistics by the gender basis. There is also, we don't have a the completely accessibility. We don't have a polling station that will be full accessible. There's also people with disability who still voted and give their votes at home place. Therefore, we need to work on this. Therefore, I have some recommendation to improve the election process and to develop the policy and to give the right to vote to everybody. The first recommendation is to continue work for people with disabilities and to develop technically and to create a reasonable accommodation for people with disabilities for each category, and that will be very important. And also continually to work on the legislative basis and also to train people with disabilities and other interested bodies that included into the election process. However, I wanted to say thank you to IFES in Kyrgyzstan. They work with OCC and trained already in cooperation with the Central Election Commission how to communicate with people with disabilities, how to work with people with disabilities, and that's very important. And finally, I wanted to say that that never we have to be satisfied that we have full realization of people with disabilities in every area, that every right of people with disabilities fully accomplished. That's the same as for right to voting. Therefore, we're just keeping forward. Thank you very much for opportunity to talk to you and to present the situation in my country. Thank you very much. And if you have a question, I will be very glad to respond on them. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Seinep. We'll take a very brief pause to allow our hardworking interpreters to catch up.
I'm sorry that I didn't keep the pause. I'm so sorry.
Not at all. Not at all. That's on me. Okay. I next then hand the word to Mariam Mikiashvili from the School for the Blind in Georgia. Mariam, please.
I didn't hear, sorry, I didn't hear.
Sorry, thank you, Seinep. We are just moving on to the next speaker, Mariam Mikiashvili. Thank you.
Hello, may I begin?
Yes, please, Mariam.
Hello, everyone. I'm from Georgia, and I would like to talk about the election process from the Georgian perspective mostly, and regarding the situation that we have in the country right now during the pandemic. But I would like to start with the history, which actually starts, our election history starts from 1918. When we had first democratic, but during these elections, women and men were equally able to vote, and also in the first Georgian parliament, there were women and also women with a minority, like ethnic minority backgrounds represented, but not women or men with disabilities at that point. Then later on, and also at that time, and also still until now, all persons with disabilities are able and allowed to vote, but the persons with disabilities, excluding persons with psychosocial or intellectual disabilities, because those with psychosocial and intellectual disabilities were considered not to be not to have the right to until 2015, around where we had a report in that sense, and also persons with intellectual and psychosocial.
Okay, we may have an issue with Mariam's internet connection.
Election process during the pandemic.
Right. Okay. Mariam, if you can hear us, I think there is an issue with your internet connection, so I will ask that we will move on to the next speaker. Mariam, I think we do not hear you very well right now. Can you try again?
Oh, okay. Can you hear me now?
Now it works fine.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Okay. During this pandemic period, we're going to have elections at the end of October, and there will be extra challenges because the polling stations will be the same. We do not have any electronic voting system or any other kind of voting system, for example, through post service, etc. People have to go in person to the polling stations and vote. But this would bring extra barriers for persons who are deaf or hard of hearing, because they will have to use the masks, and everyone will have to use the masks, those who enter the polling stations and also the members of the election commission who guide the process. This will be an extra barrier. Also, it is quite hard and create certain barriers and maybe risks, we can say it so, for blind persons or visually impaired persons, because mostly the polling stations are at schools or at the kindergartens or at the buildings which are quite old, and they are not physically accessible. And persons who are visually impaired, totally blind, for example, or partially sighted, they would require sighted guides, which means like extra contact, extra hand-to-hand contact, so to say, and this holds extra risks for virus spreading the virus. So this is a general difficulty that we have in Georgia in terms of generally, like during this pandemic, because many places are not accessible and blind people often have to use a sighted guide or ask for help, just a stranger. This really carries quite a big risk. And this also applies to the election process. Regarding the accessibility of the polling stations and the election process, through the recent years, there has been done quite a lot in terms of ballot accessibility. For example, for blind and partially sighted, there are accessible kind of ballot frames where you place a ballot and you have the appropriate numbers on this frame in braille and in tactile format, and then you can mark the number you wish by yourself. This is not restricted. So this was a very big step forward during the recent years that we have. However, inaccessibility of the polling stations is still a problem, and also that the awareness of persons with disabilities is quite low, and especially during this pandemic when people are not so willing and eager to go out and to go to the places where it's quite crowded and there is a higher risk of spreading the virus. We need quite a big work to direct toward the persons with disabilities, for them to really become active and vote, and that it's important, that it's their voice or their vote really matters. And this is a quite huge work which so far has not really been done in such a way that it's directed to the persons with disabilities. Of course, general awareness raising campaigns are going on, but nothing that is directed to the persons with disabilities. And also in terms of information accessibility, all the videos or advertisement that's made regarding the elections, the election commission usually tries to make them accessible for deaf, and they put captions. or sign language interpretation to the videos, but none of them have, for example, audio description for blind, which of course makes it less accessible for blind users. Yeah, well, this is also beyond the pandemic, and it's the same difficulty, but during this pandemic period, certain challenges have been added to what was before. In terms of running for the elections, we do not have any restrictions in that sense. Everyone can basically run and be elected, also persons with disabilities. And we have a couple of cases, not too many, but a couple of cases through years when persons with disabilities were elected in the parliament. But this is very much also connected with the awareness of the society, because very often such persons are always those who have mobility impairments and not other types of disabilities, so to say. And this is quite obvious in Georgian case, but this is not due to the law. It's just due to the awareness. And also all of them are males. We do not have any females with disabilities who have ever been elected in the in the parliament, for example, or of course not the president either. Yeah, this is, I think, the general overview I wanted to share with you. And if there are any questions or comments, I would be happy to answer them.
Thank you very much, Mariam. Thank you for your presentation, and we are looking forward to having the first woman parliamentarian with a disability in Georgia. We are looking forward to have many more women with disabilities as heads of state all over the world. So let's hope for that to come. I am about to hand over to Yuliia Sachuk from the organization Fight for Right in Ukraine. But before doing that, we again ask that those of you following the webinar using American Sign Language, go to gallery view, find the sign language interpreter who is interpreting, which will be interpreter 1, and right-click on her video feed, pin the video to follow the American Sign Language interpretation. Please, Yuliia. You are muted still.
Are you hearing me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, thank you, Marcus. Thank you, colleagues. I will try to highlight the issues that my colleagues didn't mention, but I also like to start about overall situation with political and electoral participation of people with disabilities, and to make special stress on women with disabilities political participation. We have in our parliament the first member of parliament with woman with disability, and it's a great win for us, and we are proud of this. And also after new members of Central Election Commission of Ukraine were elected in 2019, the process of developing new electoral code of Ukraine became more active. Positively, that President Zelensky personally paid special attention to the issue of accessibility and inclusiveness during the new electoral code developing. And by means of IFES Ukraine consultants and experts, people with disabilities were involved to the drafting of the code. And now we have a new electoral code which contains a range of different important provisions regarding, for example, accessibility of polling station, because code explicitly obliges the local authorities to secure the accessibility of the polling station for voters with disabilities and with low mobility. Also about accessibility of electoral information, especially obligation of media to provide different electoral information with sign language interpretations or and captions. Also about positive thing is about procedural simplification. The new code simplifies communication with the state register of voters, and it makes possible to submit different or to inclusion in the register and correct the errors online, which is very useful for people with different kinds with disabilities. However, the newly adopted electoral code of Ukraine still envisages provisions preventing people deprived of legal capacity from voting and standing for election in Ukraine. Those 30,000 of people with intellectual and psychosocial disabilities are excluded from the electoral process in the country. Also, the code doesn't envisage the secret and personal voting procedure for people with visual disability. Moreover, the newly adopted design of the ballot for October 25th local elections prevent voters with low vision from voting. Also, the code doesn't contain mandatory provisions to secure information accessibility to all information published within the election process. And the important thing that we have that the range of duty barriers is not clearly defined in the code. But at the same time, the positive things that I can highlight, that we are very thankful for Central Election Commission that together with IFES Ukraine initiated in December 2018 special Central Election Commission working group on accessibility and people with disability rights. It's a huge step forward, and it gives us opportunity to work more systematically and provide our opinion and expertise over many issues. One of the results of our joint work is the new provision which will be used during October elections, and it's more regarding architectural accessibility, and the provision clearly defined all criteria of architectural accessibility of polling station, and with accordance to the state building regulations and best international practices. Local elections, which we will have in October 25th, it's also a challenge for Ukraine and for voters with disabilities. And but positive thing that Central Election Commission initiated and special working group on elections during coronavirus pandemic, and they recommended, for example, to have also face masks, they limit number of voters on the polling station in the same time, and also recommend to have to voters to have their own pen for voting, but at the same time, there are no any recommendations regarding voters with disabilities, and as a civil society, together with IFES Ukraine, we will take this issue, and in the framework of our project Team Up for Accessible Elections, we will establish a special chat board in Telegram and informed voters with different kinds of disabilities about best practices, about the security, about their possibility to vote and to make this more comfortable for them. Also, we can mention that interest of voters with disabilities to go to the polling station became more lower. That's why we also start a big informational campaign. We will product 4 video clips about voting in the condition of pandemic, and for 4 different types of groups of voters with disabilities, with intellectual and psychosocial disability, who are blind, who are deaf, and with physical disabilities. And we will cooperate with national TV. And because many people with disabilities use this channel of communication and share information about possibility to vote and about the importance to vote on the polling station, because we are expected that most of voters who have a special who have the special mark on state register of voters as a voter with disability stay to vote at home. Also, we continue to work on electoral and political participation of women and girls with disabilities. And because as an organization of people with disabilities, co-founders of it mostly are women and girls with disabilities is our priority. And in 2018, we conduct special survey at the boarding school for between young boys and girls with disabilities, and we receive results that show us that only that with the same interest in politics from boys and girls with disabilities, the number of boys who are ready and who are ready to be active in politics is 70%, but through girls with disabilities, this number is only 30. That's why we start. Also, Ukraine doesn't. Ukraine also doesn't collect disaggregated data on gender, age, types of disability, and it's also a problem. And that's why we started, it was for us one of the reasons to start School of Political Leadership for Women and Girls with Disabilities, supported by IFES. And in 2019, we organized first school, and more than 20 girls and women, young women with different types of disability from all over Ukraine were trained, and graduates had the opportunity to have internship in central state authority bodies, for example, Office of Vice Prime Minister on European Integration, Ukrainian Cultural Foundation, also Social Policy Committee of Ukrainian Parliament, Central Election Commission. And now we are proud that one of our graduates who is blind, thanks to the knowledge and contacts gained during the school, she got a job as a teacher, and now she's also she became a candidate for the during local elections for the Kyiv Regional Council, and it's our big thing to proud. Also during the development of shadow report to UN regarding CRPD implementation, together with Kyiv International Institute of Sociology, we conduct Survive on disability rights situation in Ukraine, and we have a range of questions about political participation of people with disabilities. And since it will be the first national representative survey on disability, we will be able to receive the qualitative data to analyze and to take action forward to improve the situation, to advocate and to be active in this sphere. Regarding additional barriers, I could mention thought that our woman candidate share with me that it concerns about to organize meetings with voters offline, but at the other hand, she thinks that it's a great privilege to invite more wider audience to attend online meeting, and also I think one of our main challenge that people with disabilities, voters with disabilities in Ukraine don't receive sufficient step-by-step information about how they could vote in these conditions of pandemic. I think that the main things. Thank you for all, and will be great for questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Yuliia. Thank you for that. I am about to hand over to, excuse me, to our last speaker, Gaël Martin-Micallef. Before doing that, we'll take a brief pause to allow our interpreters to catch up. Gaël, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Magnus. Hello, everyone. I will start with a very brief anecdote. I was part of the first signatories of the Bill of Electoral Rights for Citizens with Disabilities, which was signed in September 2002, so far before the UN Convention, in Sigtuna, Sweden. At that time, there was, among other colleagues and who became friends, Richard Sudriet, the former president of IFES, among other colleagues. So this is a topic on which I'm particularly dedicated since for a long time. I will not go into many different existing instruments because I guess all participants to this webinar are aware of the existing texts, and I will refer of course, to the UN Convention on the rights of people with disabilities, and especially the Article 29 without again going into details. We issued in 2002 at the Venice Commission of the Council of Europe, the Code of Good Practice in Electoral Matters, where we, let's say, tried at that time to express the right for, let's say, based on the principle of universal suffrage, to allow any eligible citizen to vote and to stand for elections. But at that time, we were not into the latest developments regarding the rights of citizens with disabilities in terms of participating in public affairs. And we, let's say, in this very initial text, limited such political rights to the possibility by an individual judicial decision to be banned from voting and or standing for elections. Of course, in the meantime, there were many issues and many developments with regard the right of people with disabilities, and we issued an interpretive declaration of our own text, allowing, first of all, taking into account the UN Convention and allowing, let's say, recommending member states of the Venice Commission, which means larger beyond the Council of Europe's membership, to allow any citizen with disabilities to not only to vote, but also to stand for elections. You are probably also aware of the case law of the European Court of Human Rights in this regard, and especially KIS versus Hungary from May 2010. Now, coming back to the question of the participation of citizens with disabilities in elections during, I will not limit to pandemic, but during an emergency situation, which means that it could occur not only during, let's say, a period of pandemic, but also a period of natural disaster, for instance. So the challenge is how to adapt the existing rule, or how to let's say, invite our lawmakers to improve the existing electoral legal framework to take into account the particular situation of citizens with disabilities during such particular periods of pandemics, natural disaster, whatever the situation, what we would call, let's say, emergency situations. And in this respect, not specifically on persons with disabilities, I just inform you that we issued, the Venice Commission, in June 2020, a report on respect for democracy, human rights, and rule of law during states of emergency. So we developed this report with reflections, especially with a section dedicated on elections under states of emergency. Now, what could be the impact of such elections held under states of emergency, especially on electoral rights of citizens with disabilities? Well, my personal considerations would be first, not to, or let's say, the effort to avoid any blanket restrictions on any category of citizens. To take into account the proportionality when decisions, especially restrictions or legitimate restrictions on fundamental rights, to the situation of different categories of citizens, including citizens with disabilities. Referring to the fundamental rights, to the right of expression, the right of assembly, and other fundamental rights, let's say, dealing with elections and the right to free elections. So this is my first point, probably taking into account the importance of the proportionality in potential legitimate restrictions to such fundamental rights. There is also another issue I was thinking about, the campaign, the electoral campaign. Of course, we will go back to the voting operations, but there is, first of all, in the pre-electoral period, the issue of the campaign and how, for instance, to adapt campaign costs, but also from the side of the political parties, but also the public authorities. It's also how to adapt the campaigning material, especially in a period where the accessibility would be more complicated. I was also thinking regarding the voting operations, the possibility to, let's say, develop alternative means of voting. I'm cautious with this issue because I'm not sure that it would respond to the situation of every type, of every category of citizen with disabilities. I was thinking of proxy voting or voting by mail. It already exists, of course, but how to extend, how to make these means of voting more liberal, more easier, let's say easier for different categories of citizens. Sorry for the terminology category, by the way, but it's to, let's say, to simplify the debate and to make it faster. Regarding the voting operations, there are probably room for improvement, especially when it's about the sanitary measures. So I would go back to the specific situation of the pandemic. I observed the elections in Poland in June and July, the presidential election. I could see long queues because a very high turnout, which is welcome, of course, but then we can question the particular situation of citizens with disabilities in such very long days, queuing and physical accessibility to the voting centers, most of them being schools in many countries. There is probably now a responsibility of lawmakers of our states to adapt the existing rules for anticipating maybe similar situations in the future, both pandemic or natural disaster or any other emergency situations. I did not go into detail, and I will not go into detail on this issue of emergency situations. It's the expression which covers both states of emergency when it's covered by constitutional provisions and the emergency situations where countries did not go through their constitutional provisions despite recognizing a situation of emergency. So I think some questions could be raised with regard to these periods of emergency, and again, anticipating future situations, hopefully not a pandemic, but any kind of situation may appear, also with the climate change and the natural disasters. So again, I think we have now to learn lessons from the last month, especially the electoral cycles which took place during this pandemic, to adapt probably the electoral legal framework of our respective countries. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Gaël. And one last time, we ask those of you following this webinar through American Sign Language to go back to gallery view and switch to ASL Interpreter 2, who will be coming online very soon. And we will now continue with questions from you. If you do have a question, please type it into the chat box, which you will see at the bottom of your screen. While you are typing in your questions, we will hear a brief comment from the head of the Union of the Deaf in Georgia, Mr. Mariam Tunashvili. Please bear with us, because he will make his brief statement in Georgian Sign Language, which will be interpreted into spoken Georgian, which will be interpreted into English, and I will then repeat it back so that it can be interpreted into all spoken and sign languages. Please, Mr. Mariam Tunashvili.
Очень.
Sorry, but I could not understand what the gentleman has just said. Sorry, Magnus, I cannot understand what the gentleman is saying. As far as I could understand, the gentleman is referring to the fact that he cannot speak English and he is speaking in his native language. Magnus, I don't hear the sign language interpreter's voice.
Can we ask our Georgian sign language interpreter to switch her audio channel to English? Otherwise, we cannot hear her, I'm afraid. I'm afraid we cannot get this to work at this point in time. So while we're working on it, I have received some questions that I would like to ask to our panelists. A very important question is that elections are approaching in Kyrgyzstan, in Georgia, and in Ukraine. What tips or lessons on increasing access and inclusion would you share with advocates from other countries as they begin to prepare for their elections? If we can ask possibly Yuliia to give a brief answer to that first. Or Mariam.
Sorry, can you repeat please question?
Yes, so the question is, what tips or lessons that you have learned on increasing access in relation to elections that you would give for advocates in other countries?
I can share our experience and I think the most positive thing is about establishment of special working group by Central Election Commission, and the force of this group is that it contains as members of Central Election Commission also people with disabilities and representative of IFES Ukraine and other civil society organizations and experts, and it gives us opportunity to work really step by step, systematically on different documents, different issues to discuss, to find ways to organize, I don't know, focus groups, to involve different audiences, and to make electoral policy more accessible and more appropriate for in the condition of our country. and we really see clear results of every hour effort.
Thank you very much, Yuliia. Mariam or Seinep, would either of you want to address this same issue? Seinep?
Yes, we also, IFES also developed a working group, and now they are, as I said, doing the pre-monitoring process, because they need to be sure that everything is okay and every facilities for people with visual impairments, for people with hearing impairments are ready for voting process. And we also have electronic options for votes. As colleagues mentioned, that we have also videos for if we have a propaganda of some candidates or parties, also in sign languages. That's a very big deal, a very good progress. Therefore, I think it's very good to develop IT technologies during the voting process, and also because of the pandemic situation, we need to keep the electronic options for votes, maybe for voting at home. Nevertheless, it is not a very good practice to vote at home, as I mentioned before. But because of the pandemic situation, it is a good way for saving the people's health. And I wanted to also add about the Kyrgyz Republic ratified the convention in the last year on March 14th. The IFES and other international organizations and people with disabilities actively participated in this process. Therefore, we hope that after ratification, all of the gaps and issues on infrastructures and procedures will be eliminated. But it is very early to say how it will be, because we only will have the election in October. Therefore, we can just learn some lessons only after the election process will be done.
Thank you very much, Seinep. Mariam, do you want to address this same issue?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
So maybe I will not say anything new, but the most important is the information accessibility for all persons, because they need to have quality information about the candidates, about their programs, about the procedures of elections, and this is the most important. I think the web page accessibility, as well as the TV advertisement accessibility, is very important, and also when there are the meetings of the political candidates to the communities, they often have the flyers or booklets, and these should be made accessible. For example, for blind, they should be offered in alternative formats so that everybody can have equal access to them. And also the accessibility of polling stations, which is, I think, the largest maybe challenge. This is a very big challenge because it's not easy to do.
Please go on, Mariam.
Okay, so this is not easy to do because these polling stations do not belong to the election commission. They are usually rented or borrowed from other government bodies. But this is very important, because if we want to accomplish high voting rates among persons with disabilities, we have to have accessible polling stations and accessible ballots and accessible information. So this is like all together that we have to reach the high number of voters, of persons with disabilities.
Thank you very much, Mariam. I have received one question for Virginia and one from Gaël from the Venice Commission. If we start with Gaël, how can disabled persons organizations best provide feedback to the Venice Commission on election access issues?
Well, I can be the contact person, the focal point of such questions or information. It's always useful for the Venice Commission to get such feedback, such experience, especially because we, on a regular basis, we accompany the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe to observe a number of elections. And time to time, we are able also to observe the question of accessibility of citizens with disabilities to elections. But of course, it is limited to the voting day and to the voting operations. So it can be interesting as well to have, let's say, information, reports, feedback on the pre-electoral steps of any electoral process. For instance, the access to information, the media coverage, and all the issues that could be quite challenging for people with disabilities. I can leave you my email address in the chat, for instance.
That would be excellent. Thank you very much, Gaël. And we also have a comment from Gudana Rajko from Serbia. I will not read that out for time reasons, but that also has information. The entire chat readout will be available afterwards. Thank you, Gaël. Before we move to the last question for Virginia, should we try once again to hear the comment from Amiram Batatunashvili? I think we have sorted out the
თარჯიმას ვთხოვ, ქართულად ვისაუბრებ და თარგმნოს. ხო, არის ტექნიკურად, კი ბატონო. ძალიან საინტერესო.
So the discussion is very interesting. Thank you very much for raising this topic. So there one point is important. You must be aware that from 23 of September, from yesterday to so I congratulate you on the day of the gesture language regarding the electoral process and the barriers. So you have met the processes existing in your countries related to people with disabilities. Yes, I do agree that in every country we have a problem. One of the hugest problem, which is for hearing impaired people, this is the problem of access to information. So the lack of information for these people. So for people with impaired hearing, they don't have the opportunity to select a party actually. So their plans, their future initiatives, so they don't have the opportunity to hear out the plans, because besides the advertising, so the conferences and meetings are not translated into sign language. We, in Georgia, so by the third hearing in the parliament after the huge combat, so the gesture language was adopted and it was recognized as language, and I am hoping that in the future state will undertake many good steps for the people with hearing impairment. As a result of the huge endeavor, we attained that the public broadcaster to have the informational programs in gesture language, but other webinars or other informational means, they are not translated for in gesture language. So for receiving the full-bodied information is a warranty for the correct choice and to participate in the democratic build-up of the government, of the state. And there is the deplorable fact that So only this year we have started very active work on this topic, and I'm very delighted that the steps are undertaken to create the equal environment for people, not only people with hearing impairment, but with the people with disabilities totally. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Batatonishvili, and thank you very much to our Georgian Sign Language interpreter and our Georgian voiced interpreter. I will very briefly summarize what was being said, because that would not have been available to anyone listening in a language other than Georgian or English. So Mr. Batatonishvili said how this was a very interesting discussion and very important topic, noting that we have just experienced the International Sign Language Day. He does realize that all countries have problems, and he stressed that for people with hearing disabilities, hearing impairment, the major issue is access to information in a political and electoral context. But very often information is not provided in an accessible format. This includes in Georgia, although sign language is a recognized language in the Georgian context, which includes the fact that many webinars are not available in sign language, unlike this one. He did note, Mr. Batatonishvili, that work is ongoing in this area. Thank you very much, Mr. Batatonishvili, for that comment. Very much appreciated. I'm going to direct the last question to Virginia Atkinson. If you could identify just one thing that election management bodies can do to make elections accessible, what would that be?
If I only get one, then the number one thing I would say that election management bodies can do is to consult with DPOs, consult with people with disabilities. So reach out to the different disabled persons organizations in your country and ask them what solutions would work best in your country context.
Thank you very much, Virginia. We are approaching the end of our time together. I want to conclude the webinar by thanking all of our panelists for your presentations and your insights, all of our participants for being with us in this incredibly interesting webinar, to USAID for supporting our event. I want to give an amazing thank you to all our interpreters, both into spoken and sign language. Don't know how many webinars that I've had 11 languages simultaneously. And I want to thank our IFES staff who have worked very hard to prepare for this event. The next installment, both the topic for this webinar series, will be announced soon, and we will be inviting you and hope to see you all at the next event. Until then, stay safe.